He won victories in the red deserts, on the snowy peaks of the Alps, among the giant waves of the seas. He fought the fearsome barbarians of the forests, the Persians and Arabs of the east, and even the Turks. He fell into the streets, hungry and wretched. He was tested by lust and treachery, by wealth and loyalty. Few warriors have achieved what he did. Few people have seen what he saw. The wind of sultanate takes heads. He is Belisarius, the great conqueror of all of Rome. The year is 505. Only stories have survived from the ancient past of the Roman Empire. North Africa, Spain, and Italy have fallen completely into the hands of ruthless barbarians. The Roman state was confined to its eastern territories and continues to shrink. Although the dream of all Romans was to restore the empire's former borders and maturity, it was nothing more than a dream. Belisarius was born into a noble family in Thrace, a small family. His primary education was in the ancient Roman tradition of the ancestors, known as mos maiorum rum. This meant loyalty, trust in family, respect for the homeland, and the ability to remain calm, even in the most difficult circumstances. He grew up speaking 3 languages: Thracian, his native language, Latin, the official language of Rome, and Greek. In his 15s, Belisarius arrived in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. In those years, it was customary for nobles to serve as constraining officers in the military. During the exciting days of his youth in Constantinople, he met a man who would change his life forever. This man was the young Justinian, nephew of Emperor Justin. Justinian and Belisarius formed a close friendship. Because they were both Thracians, and in these places where Thracians were despised by the people, it didn't take long for them to become good friends. Whenever the two met, they always talked about the same topic: retaking the entire Mediterranean, all the way to Gibraltar. And at this very moment, something as expected happened. Emperor Justin died on August 1, 527, leaving only one heir, his nephew, Justinian. Fate was quickly paving the way for the two. Thanks to his friendship with the new emperor, Belisarius was granted his first major assignment: the formation and leadership of the royal guard. This was the emperor's special elite group of 7,000 heavily armored cavalrymen, and Belisarius was in charge. And very soon his adventure would begin. He might even find himself proving himself on the battlefield. The year was 530.
The Persians, the old enemy in the east, are intent on reasserting themselves. For 600 years, countless wars, both large and small, had already been fought between Rome and the Persians. They had seen many Roman generals aspiring to be a new Alexander the Great, but this time it was Belisarius, general of the eastern armies, who arrived. Belisarius rebuilt Dara fortress and deployed 25,000 soldiers to this region. The Persian army numbered approximately 50,000. The Persians were confident of victory. Their general even sent a letter to Belisarius saying, "I'm coming soon. Build me a bathhouse in Dara fortress and even build a tomb for you." However, Belisarius's clever tactics on the battlefield and his ability to lure his Persians into a trap led the 50,000-strong Persian army to defeat, and they were forced to flee. The great commander had won his first great victory. Although Isay was later defeated by the Persians and summoned to the capital, this defeat would actually open the door to a new and great opportunity for Belisarius. Ever since the Roman state banned gladiatorial combat, horse races had been the center of entertainment. These races were held in the Hippodrome in Constantinople. In fact, the obelisks in Sultan Ahmed's palace today were landmarks in the center of the hippodrome and are the last remaining parts of it. There were two major fanatical fan groups, the Blues and the Greens. Belisarius's advisor, Procopius, wrote the following about the fans. In every city, the groups have long been divided into Blues and Greens, spending money. They fight against the rival group and kill each other in the streets, unaware of why they are taking such a risk. What began as a demonstration against injustice and corruption at the Hippodrome races in January 532, fueled by widespread discontent with Justinian's rule, escalated into a violent uprising complete with Nika, or triumphal chants. Fans and the populace set fire to the city as if it had fallen into enemy hands. Much of the city was burned to the ground. The homes of wealthy residents were looted. Hagia Sophia was almost completely destroyed. In fact, the Hagia Sophia you see today is the Hagia Sophia rebuilt after this uprising. Emperor Justinian even considered fleeing the city. However, his wife, Theodora, convinced the emperor to fight the rebels, saying, "Fleeing may save us for a while, but the purple cloak of the kingdom is the best shroud." Belisarius and his commander Mundus, who had fortunately returned from their mission in the east, were in the capital and devised a bloody plan. First, the rebels would be distracted by bribes, and Belisarius and Mundus, along with their soldiers, would surround the hippodrome from two opposing sides.
Belisarius's men massacred all the rebels that day. Historical records indicate that between 30,000 and 60,000 rebels were slaughtered within a few hours, and rivers of blood flowed in the city streets for days. This event, the Nika Revolt, was the bloodiest uprising that Constantinople, and later Istanbul, had ever witnessed. Belisarius, who played a key role in suppressing the uprising, once again proved his loyalty to the emperor. The two friends were reconciled, and Belisarius was now the general of all Roman armies. And interestingly, he had a spy who would remain by his side throughout his life. Belief in all soldiers, Belisarius was the most popular general in the country, so Queen Theodora had no trust in him. Therefore, Theodora forced Belisarius, her closest confidant, to marry Antonina. Furthermore, in defiance of all Roman traditions, Belisarius had to accompany Antonina even on distant campaigns. It is clear that this marriage was arranged by Theodora to plant a spy alongside Belisarius. Although his rivals claimed that Antonina had repeatedly cheated on Belisarius, Belisarius, accustomed to intrigue, neither believed these allegations nor renounced his loyalty to his wife until his death. He was an honest soldier and a devoted husband. The great adventure begins. With the end of internal turmoil in Eastern Rome, the duo was now able to create the right environment to implement their grand plan. Their first target was the Vandals, who had held control of North Africa for 100 years. The Vandals, of Germanic origin, were ruthless, fierce, and hulking warriors. Many lands, from the Strait of Gibraltar to Sardinia, from Libya to Carthage, were in their hands. Emperor Justinian gave Belisarius his order: "Go and save Africa. Rome is with you." While Belisarius and his troops were sailing towards Africa, they were caught in a terrible storm. As some of the Roman ships, buffeted by the storm, sank, Belisarius donned his armor to encourage his frightened soldiers, drew his sword, and, stepping onto the ship's deck amidst the waves, declared, "Brave soldiers of Rome, we have shed blood shoulder to shoulder before. I defy the lightning and the waves. If my sword falls here, will you not take it and carry it to Carthage?" Belisarius landed with approximately 20,000 men. He quickly advanced to Carthage, the Vandal capital. Wisely, he ordered his soldiers not to pluck fruit from anyone's tree without paying for it, and not to plunder. He added, valor cannot be victorious unless it is combined with justice. Gelimer, king of the Vandals, a ruthless warrior. Belisarius personally fought on the battlefields, and even during one of the most challenging moments of the conflict, despite his shattered helmet and broken sword, he single-handedly charged to encourage his retreating soldiers and turned the tide of the battle. The Vandals tried countless ways to tempt Belisarius. Authentic black women were repeatedly sent to his tent as gifts. They invited esteemed tribal leaders to unimaginable orgies of pleasure, but he would not fall into any temptation. And what happened at the end of the year-long war? North Africa, Corsica, Sardinia, and both sides of the Strait of Gibraltar were recaptured. However, his rivals in Constantinople, claiming he intended to establish a kingdom for himself, conspired, and he returned victoriously to the capital in March 534. Among the captives he brought were Gelimer, the great king of the Condalians, and the Jewish treasury of Jerusalem. Ironically, the first to bring the treasures of Jerusalem was pagan Rome in 70 AD. Now it was Christian Rome. Their religion had changed.
But Rome was still Rome. With the emperor's trust, he once again cast aside the jealousies and intrigues that hung in the shadow of the throne. But his spirit was too vast to be confined to the palace. He was a general. He was an adventurer. His fate was forged on the battlefield and the seas. A few months after his return, Justinian summoned Belisarius and said, "Sword of Rome, save the eternal city and bring Italy back to us." At that time, the lands of Italy were under Gothic rule. The Goths were a Germanic people, descended from the Vandals, and were just as fierce warriors. Setting out in 535 with approximately 7,000 men, Belisarius initially took control of Sicily with his small number of soldiers. He knew full well that wars were won not by numbers, but by intelligence. Due to the rebellions in Africa, he returned and solved that problem. Soon after, he turned his attention back to Italy. He quickly conquered half the country and turned his attention to Rome. When they arrived in Rome, the city had already been abandoned. The Goths' goal was to return stronger. Thus, on December 9, 536, the city of Rome, which had created an empire, fell once again into Roman hands. Rome, which embraced Belisarius, was a mere shadow of its former glory. However, as the eternal city, it held spiritual significance. Belisarius was in the city with 5,000 soldiers. Knowing that the Goths would return, he prepared to defend the city. The Goths soon laid siege to Rome with 25,000 soldiers. However, instead of remaining behind the walls, Belisarius led his army out of the city, and Romans and Goths faced each other on the plain of Nero. Seeing the Roman army, the Gothic king Wittings addressed his soldiers, "We will not only defeat our opponents, we will punish them for their arrogance. Their courage has been fueled by undeserved luck. Now luck is on our side." However, the Goths retreated with minor skirmishes. While pursuing them, Belisarius divided his army into three. His aim was to make them think they were larger, and this strategy worked. In November 539, he turned towards Riven, the Goths' last city and capital, and at this point a curious event took place. The Goth sons planned to dethrone their king Wittix and offer Belisarius the throne of the Western Roman Empire. This was a good deal for both sides, and Belisarius accepted the offer. But wasn't this a betrayal of his own emperor? No, my friends, for he was a loyal general, and as soon as he entered the city, he seized King Wittix and the treasures of God. The fatherland was now reunited with Rome.
Belisarius took King Witiges and the treasures to Constantinople. However, upon his return, the Goths in Italy resumed their rebellion. Two Gothic spies even managed to reach Persian territory disguised as priests and persuade the Persians to wage war against Rome. Meanwhile, King Khosrow was on the Persian throne. Khosrow quickly entered Roman territory, quickly capturing cities as far as Antioch. He even responded to Justinian's peace offer by ritually bathing in the sea at Antioch. This signaled his arrival in Constantinople, marking the first time in 600 years that a Persian king had bathed in the Mediterranean. Belisarius was sent from the capital to lead the attack against Khosrow in the spring of 541. So much so that upon hearing of Belisarius's arrival, Khosrow had already sent his envoys to initiate peace negotiations. It is a fact that Khosrow's actions constitute one of the fastest reverse gears in history. There is bad news from the capital. A massive plague is devastating the Roman Empire, so to speak. Contemporary writers estimate that the disease wiped out 300,000 people in the capital alone. 300,000 people, at least half of the city's population. The dead were hidden on the roofs of houses to avoid being left on the streets. And worst of all, since Emperor Justinian had also contracted the plague, some soldiers in the palace began to loudly declare that Belisarius should ascend to the throne in the event of the emperor's death. However, by a miracle, Justinian recovered. Agreeing with Belisarius's belief that he had aspirations to the throne, he stripped him of all his duties and confiscated most of his property. Belisarius, the conqueror of Africa and Italy, was now nothing. His advisor Procopius wrote of those days, "What a sad sight, what an unbearable sight it was to see Belisarius wandering the streets, a desolate citizen. Almost alone, always somber and sullen, with a murderer's knife constantly at his back." But this state of affairs did not last long. Because of his wife Antonina's struggles and the fact that he was the only person capable of suppressing the Gothic rebellions in Italy, Justinian summoned an old friend back to his presence.
Belisarius again assigned to suppress the rebellions in Italy in 544. However, the general, stripped of everything, had no remaining enthusiasm, nor was the emperor able to provide the necessary support to suppress the rebellions. Therefore, 4 years later, he left his duties to other commanders and returned to the capital, Constantinople. The old warrior was a very man. Remaining as an advisor to the emperor rather than brandishing his sword in the field would have been a better option, and it proved so. He spent nearly 10 years on diplomatic missions and providing counsel. But perhaps he too hadn't expected to be needed in the field one last time. His new rivals, the Turks, forced Belisarius back onto the battlefield. The Kutrigers, a Turkic nomadic horse tribe, commonly accepted by European historians, began launching attacks on Roman territory near the Danube River in 559. Their leader was Zabergant. Because the Romans supported their enemies, Zabergant launched attacks almost as far as Constantinople. Aegetis, a contemporary writer, writes the following about the Kutrigers' reason for their attack. The Kutrigers are a force to be reckoned with and feared, and they are undertaking this expedition to demonstrate that they will not tolerate any disrespect. Unable to turn to anyone, Justinian turned to the only man he could trust, Belisarius. Because Belisarius knew how to fight the nomadic peoples of Asia very well. Witnesses describe Belisarius's preparations as follows. The great commander donned his armor and helmet. He donned the familiar uniform of his youth. The memory of his past exploits flooded the old man's mind, filling him with the fire of his youth. Arriving near the capital, the Kutrigers had to pass through a forest, and Belisarius divided his troops into 3 groups and set up a trap. He ordered one group to create a great deal of noise and dust. After the signal was given, the Kutrigers, who were being held back by the hail of arrows fired by the hiding soldiers, were confused by the noise and dust, and were forced to retreat. This was Belisarius's final victory. He had saved the capital, But unfortunately, he was not even congratulated by the emperor. Because the court, a world of poisonous snakes and intrigue, had conspired to erase the memory of his victory and discredit him, further discrediting the old general. And now, the great commander was exhausted. He was tired of the wars, the lies, and the hardships of a fast-paced life. Although summoned to his presence again by the emperor sometime later, Belisarius the Elder retired to his farm near Constantinople and died peacefully and wealthy at home, at the age of approximately 64. One of the greatest military geniuses of all time had passed away. An era has ended. Did he ever imagine that a life filled with hardship would still be recounted today, that his name would be associated with Alexander the Great and Caesar? Perhaps yes. Did you notice that I didn't call the Eastern Roman Empire Byzantine in the video? Because the term Byzantine was coined by European historians in the last several centuries to avoid confusion. The Eastern Romans never called themselves Byzantines. In fact, they probably hadn't even heard of the word. That's why Mehmet the Conqueror, of Constantinople, Mehmet the Conqueror, earned himself the title of Kaiser of Rum, that is, the Roman Emperor. That's why Suleiman the Magnificent described himself as the heir of Alexander the Great and Caesar.